Whiskey Jason here, whiskey from the viewpoint of an American over here in Germany. Today I'm doing something different. I've been asked by many people over here in Germany, hey, if we have 50% tariffs on American whiskey, what can we drink instead? Maybe Canadian whiskey. But I don't know much about Canadian whiskey, Jason. Can you please tell me something about it? Well, luckily, there is a guy, I'm going to just put down his website here below, and I'm actually going to share my screen real quick. He wrote about it. That's Michael. So, Michael R. Veach is a Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame historian and author. I love his newsletter I get almost every other day. And he wrote about Canadian whiskey versus bourbon whiskey. My entire video is based upon his thoughts here. And he talks about the 6 different sources of flavor. And he's going to compare the two, and I'm going to compare the two as well. So thank you, Michael, for allowing me. I don't know if you allowed me or not. Thank you very much for inspiring me to talk about the same things you did. All right, so let's talk first about the differences between American whiskey and Canadian whiskey. And we're going to talk about the grain, the mash bill. Now, we know bourbon has to be at least 51% rye. We know rye has to be, bourbon has to be 51% corn. Rye has to be 51% rye. Wheat has to be 51% wheat, not wheated bourbon, but wheat whiskey. You also have here a malt whiskey. If you go to Woodford Reserve, they have that 51% malted barley. And now we even have a single malt, 100% malted barley from one distillery. Canadian, they don't really have any grain requirement whatsoever. I always love telling the story. There have been rye whiskeys from Canada with 0 rye in them, because rye whiskey just means whiskey, just like whiskey means Scotch in the UK. So bourbon can be made from 100% corn. It doesn't need any flavoring grains, but it usually does have that. We talk about a high rye bourbon, maybe with 10, 20, 30% rye. We talk about a wheated bourbon that has no rye, but instead has wheat. Now, you can have reservoir rye or reservoir bourbon, 100% corn. And we just, in the industry, often use enzymes. You throw a little bit of enzymes just to make sure you have a fermentation in there. Doesn't cost much, and actually make sure that you don't waste 20,000 gallons of mash, for example. All right. So Canada, no grain requirement. What I do know is they often, not exclusively, but often distill 100% rye, 100% corn, 100% wheat, and then afterwards they'll blend them together. So Dr. Don Livermore talks about that a lot. He's up there at Hiram Walker. Very, very interesting guy. They're doing great things there. Tiny little, just a statement at the beginning. Canada, let us have some of your good products. At the end of my video, I'll be talking about at least the Canadian products that are available here in Germany, and there's not that many, to be honest. All right, the second source of flavor comes from the water. Now, in today's distilling, almost everyone uses reverse osmosis. It's treated water to make their mash, to make their wort. All right. So even when they're reducing down to barrel strength or to cask strength or to drinking strength, they put usually reverse osmosis water in there. I know that when we talk about Tennessee and Kentucky, we talk about that hard limestone water there. If you ever go to Scotland, they'll talk about the soft water there and how important that is for their whiskey making tradition. Now, good. There are, I'm sure, some Canadian distilleries that have iron-free water from natural sources to make the whiskey. I've never heard anyone from Canada talking about their water source. In America, yeah, I visited the water sources. I was at New Riff, and I started my video there on the parking lot looking at the well. I've been to Jack Daniels, and we looked at the cave with the nice little, with the source of the water coming up from that spring there. a lot of distilleries in America say water, water, water. So Canada, I've never heard anything. Fermentation. Now, the third source of flavor, of course, is fermentation. Now, both sides of the border, Canada and US, actually use different methods of fermentation. There's sweet mash, there's sour mash. Sour mash, you take something from the previous mash and put it back into the next. You lower the pH value a little bit. Dr. Jim Crow, 120 some years ago, he invited the industry, by the way, a Scottish scientist, invited the American industry to use the sour mash method. Almost everyone uses it. Some very small places don't use it, and big places like Wilderness Trail, Peerless, Hard Truth, they don't. They use the sweet mash, and that's very important. Now, pot still distilleries, there's quite a few of them in America as well as also in Canada. They like to use a wort instead of a mash. Now, what is the difference? A mash means you're on grain. So you have your fermentation tank and you pump that fermentation into a beer well, and the beer well is usually pumped directly into a column still. And that column still will run as long as you keep on putting something in that beer well. That beer well is like a hopper, is like a buffer, and if that ever runs dry, you have to shut down the column still. So now, if you have a pot still, each and every batch, you have to actually wash it out. Now, if you distill with the grain together, you're often going to have burnage. That means the grain will stick to the sides of that copper pot still and get burnt. So therefore, just every single distillery in Scotland uses wort. No one uses mash. All right, so they actually separate the grains from that sugary liquid. That's a wort, and they distill that. Now, almost every place that I've been to that actually uses a column still says, hey, we have a mash, and that's just fine. All right, so now talking about fermentation, you need to talk about yeast. In America, almost every distillery is proud of their yeast strains. I mean, Wilderness Trail, before they became Wilderness Trail, Dr. Pat Heist had Firm Solution with his buddy. And they discovered this yeast strain from a pecan nut. And they actually grew it and were able to allow TX Distilling, Robertson, and Firestone Distilling in Fort Worth to use that yeast strain to actually make some of the best rye and whiskeys I've had ever. That's fabulous. Every single place in America basically tries to use their own yeast strain if possible. Now, all the bigger companies at the moment, if it's Buffalo Trace, if it's Heaven Hill, they're actually creating their own yeast laboratories to have full control of the yeast, because that's where alcohol is made. It's not distilling where alcohol is made. Distilling concentrates the aromas that you have already from the yeast, from the fermentation. Now, it could be Canadians have their own yeast as well, but I've never heard of it. They've never mentioned it in any type of marketing or advertising or master classes. Now, I do know Seagram's used to be, before they went bankrupt, they used to have the 5 different yeast strains from Four Roses, for example. And I assume, as well as Michael Veach here, that Crown Royal Canadian whiskey still uses some of those different yeast strains also. But it's not a big factor like it is in the States. By the way, just a little elbow shot over to Scotland. Up until 2008, they could only use distiller's yeast. It wasn't even allowed to use brewer's yeast. And basically, there's only 2 types of yeast normally used in Scotland, either brewer's yeast or distiller's yeast. Yes, there's been experimentations with some champagne yeast and some Chardonnay yeast and so on, but it's very, 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 very minute that they actually do that, because don't forget, Scotch wants to have yield, quantitate, not always from the taste side of the point, quality. They'll do that later on with finish and casks. All right, fermentation. Distillation. Let's talk about distillation for a moment. The fourth source of flavor is distillation. Bourbon has to be distilled at no higher than 160 proof, 80% alcohol. Canada, interesting enough, has an upper distillation proof of 90% alcohol, 180 proof. So that's interesting. Both sides of the border use column stills, both sides use pot stills, depends on where you're at. In Scotland, it's what, 94.6%. And then after that, if you go 1% more, it's neutral spirit. And so, why? Those esters, those contingers, we want that in the whiskey. That's why they say only 80%, because that 20% is what's left of flavor. Ethanol is flavorless, but all that flavor comes through in our American whiskeys because it's max 80. Most do 70, some do 60 something. It just depends on what's going on there. All right, so that's a little bit of a difference. Maturation. Ooh, this is a big difference. All right, good. So bourbon, as you know, has to be aged in a new, unused, charred oak barrel. New, unused, charred oak container barrel. Canada does not have any requirements for their whiskey, just barrel. It can be a reused barrel, it can be an uncharred barrel. It can be. Oh, I like this. There was I'm going to talk about J.P. Weiser's triple barrel. They have an ex-bourbon barrel, they have a Canadian barrel, and they have a virgin oak. I was like, what in all the world is Canadian? Oh, that means there's Canadian whiskey in it before. I said, what was before Canadian? I'm bourbon. It was just like, okay, good. Yeah, they claim that it's now a Canadian barrel because Canadian whiskey was in it. I just love that. All right. Just like a rum cask is a rum cask. It was beforehand a bourbon barrel, by the way. So bourbon has to be entered into the barrel at no higher than 125 proof, 62.5%. Many distilleries, Wilderness Trail, New Riff, Peerless, and many others, Wild Turkey, don't do it at 62.5%. They do it at a lower ABV, a lower barrel entry proof. Canada doesn't have any requirements whatsoever. They could enter theoretically at 90%. They could, some places in Scotland have also no rule. They could do it at 70%, 80%. They can enter the whiskey into the barrel at any proof they wish. Now, America, 62.5. Bourbon is considered bourbon as soon as it enters into a new charred oak barrel. There is no age requirement. So you put it in there, you empty it, there's a color change because it's charred in the inside. It's bourbon. Now, if you want to call it straight bourbon, you need to have at least 2 years in the barrel. And if you want to actually not have an age statement on it, you need 4 years in the barrel. So most of the whiskeys, at least here in Germany or in Europe that we get from America, they're all called straight bourbon whiskey. And 95 are going to be Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And there's always going to be, usually there's not going to be an age statement. So they've been aged for 4 years in new charred oak barrels. Now, in Canada, it's interesting. They do have a rule, 3 years. And they do have a second rule, no bigger than 700 liters. Now, in America, we don't have that rule with size. With single malt, we do, but not with our bourbon barrels, we don't. Just like we do with our single malt in America and also over in Europe. Everything always says in barrels no larger than 700 liters. Why do you ask? Because many places actually have these big fodders, Foeders, that can be, and we have one in Germany, it's 100,000 liters. It's the entire basement of this city hall that they would put wine in there and just leave it in there and then just fill it up the next year and fill it up and fill it up. And it was just crazy. And so, hey, they made very big barrels over here. That's why we have that requirement. Last but not least, and maybe the most important, is bottling. Jason, it just didn't put in the bottle. No. This is where Canada and American whiskey has a big difference. Now, bourbon has to be bottled at least at 40% alcohol. Nothing can be added to it except water. No coloring. No additives. The only thing you can add is to just the proof water. Now, Canadian whiskey can add caramel coloring, just like Ireland and Scotland. Doesn't have to be mentioned on the label. And they can add, and this is something that blows my mind all the time, they can add so-called flavoring agents. These flavoring agents can be prune juice, cherry juice. They can also add wine or spirits up to 9.09%. Now, if they do add spirits, these spirits have to be aged for at least 2 years beforehand. Wow, I'm not even sure. I did not research this. Please tell me in the comments. Do they need to put that on the label if they do add those flavoring agents to the whiskey? 9.9. Imagine you had a 1 liter bottle. You're going to add 9 CLs cherry juice to a product. That's going to change it. You're going to add 9 CLs of wine to it. You're going to add 9 CLs of rum to it. You're going to add 9 CLs of port to it. Crazy. All right. So we have these different 6 things. We have the grains, we have the water, we have the fermentation, we have the distillation, we have the maturation, the bottling. That is where those different flavor profiles can come from. Now, I'm just going to show you some of the whiskeys at the moment that we have over here in Germany. My favorite Canadian whiskey is this, Lot 40. If you've never tried Lot 40, do it now. Go out and find a bottle of this. This is 100% rye whiskey. This is aged in new oak barrels. This is actually copper pot distilled. This is 43% alcohol. This is one of my favorite rye whiskeys in the world for the value for money. This is under 40 euros here. On sale, I can get it for 32. Lot 40, beautiful, beautiful bottle. I can highly, highly recommend it. Fairly new on the scene. Oh, I forgot to show that in my German video. Is Macalonis. Macalonis is Vancouver Island, basically in British Columbia in Canada. They do a lot of stuff. They have single malts. They have single pot stills. A lot of wood influence. A lot of very interesting products going on in there. Macalonis, I'm not sure of their distribution in the States, if they've done all 50 states yet or not. If you have not tried them, please try before you buy. I like them. There's peated, there's unpeated, and they have a lot, as I talked about, casks. We have Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez and Muscatel and all these different things going on there. Now, Canadian Club, I have a 15-year-old Canadian Club. This is actually not bad, to be honest. All right, 42%. This is a sherry cask. The Canadian Club Invitation Series, nice. Value for money, I don't know, but the normal Canadian Club, sorry, not for me, not my cup of tea. And the same thing is going to be here for the Crown Royal. I have an XR here. This is an old bottle here. I've had it for a couple of years. This was actually the final batch of rare whiskeys from the La Salle distillery. This is something, Crown Royal. Normal stuff, no. Special stuff, yes. What I don't have, and I mentioned just a moment ago, is the JP Weisers. I would like to show that. That's kind of interesting. We have the Crown Royal Northern Harvest Rye. Not bad. And we have over here in Germany also a Pike Creek 10-year-old. It used to be port, now it's 10 years old with a rum cask finish. So, and that's it. We don't have anything else over in Germany that is readily available coming out of Canada. That's it. That's really, really kind of sad. And therefore, if people come up to me and say, Jason, can Canadian whiskey maybe replace our American whiskey if we have these evil 50% tariffs from the European Union, by the way? I really feel punished. We are bringing over a pallet at the moment, right before April 1st. Let's say it's going to cost 40,000 euros. If we're just a day or two too late after that deadline, it would have been 60,000 euros. That's 20,000 euros on top of penalty. Tariffs are penalties for me as the purchaser of this whiskey from the United States. And I import. This is one of the things I do. This is one of my lifelines here. And I really, really feel, punished at the moment from the European Union for this trade war that's going on, has been going on since 2018 with steel and aluminum. What do jeans, what do Harleys, and what do bourbon have to do with steel and aluminum? Brussels, European Union, very disappointed in you here. So, no, Canada is not a adequate replacement. There's not much out there. There's some good rye, and after that, it's very slim pickings. What did I forget? What can you get in the States that I can't get over here in Europe? What can you get in the UK that I can't get over here? What good products from Canada would you also recommend? Now, I do know that they have in Canada great whiskeys, and usually they stay in Canada. So the good Canadian whiskeys are in Canada, and they don't export it to America. They don't export it to Europe. They don't export it to Asia. Thank you, Canada. We love you, but share a little bit more of that good whiskey you have there. Thank you very much for watching, liking, subscribing. Comment down below what is your favorite Canadian whiskey. Bye-bye.